Hi everybody, this is the second video about writing an APUSH that I'm putting together for you. This one is about context and evidence is where the bulk of the points for your essay will come from. If you look at this handy chart, you can see that your long essay question will be scored on a 6-point rubric. 1 point for thesis, 1 point for contextualization, up to 2 points for evidence, and up to 2 points for analysis and reasoning. Your thesis and contextualization points, you can get those right off the bat in your introduction. So that first paragraph is going to be really important. The analysis and reasoning points, those are related to the prompt. So in the first video, I emphasized how important it was to take a minute and break down the prompt. And you need to do that so that you are actually doing the analysis and reasoning that the prompt is asking you to do. If you follow the thesis statement template from that first video, you're also setting up your argument to help you get the 2 analysis and reasoning points. I suggest right now that you pause this video and take a minute and look at the long essay rubric that you have in your packet of slides for this video. Look it over and look at the details of how to earn the 2 points for analysis and reasoning and evidence, and then the 1 point for thesis and contextualization. When you look at analysis and reasoning and the points there, I've broken down the rubric, and you'll only be scored by one of the skills, the skill that the prompt is asking of you. So take a look at that rubric now so that you can ask questions in class. If you think back to the first video, we went over the first 3 steps that you should quickly go through when you start writing your long essay. So you should take a moment to break down the prompt so you know what you're being asked, then brainstorm for a few minutes so that you can get your head in the game and think about a direction for your essay, and then write your thesis statement. And the thesis statement, remember, is so important for setting up the rest of your paper, that single sentence. So make sure that you structure that in a strong way. Once you've done that, step 4 is write the essay. So you should have 5 paragraphs in your essay. So the structure here is based on the thesis statement template that I walked you through in our first video. And remember, you could say X is true, however A and B, therefore Y. And the alternative thesis statement structure was although X, A and B, therefore Y. So this you can see really quickly. Your 5 paragraphs correspond to those letters that are in the thesis statement template. Paragraph 1, you'll do context and thesis statement, and I'll walk you through context in a minute. Paragraph 2 will be your X paragraph. Remember, that's supposed to be like your counterclaim, but it's not like the way they've taught you counterclaim in ELA. It's not the opposite of your claim. Instead, it's an acknowledgement of an alternative interpretation. For example, you might, if you're writing an essay about European colonization, you might acknowledge that religious beliefs caused European colonization, but they were not as important as perhaps economic pursuits and military competition between European powers. So it's not that the X is not true or that you completely disagree with it. It's just that you think other things are more important. And then last, you'll do paragraph 5. If you have time, your conclusion. Sometimes you'll run out of time. The conclusion is the cherry on top of the sundae. And so if you get there, great. And if you don't, then it's not going to kill your score. If you look at the rubric, it doesn't say you must have a conclusion. So let's look at how to write the context portion of your essay and what that's all about. All of the essays that you write on the AP exam, the long essay and the DBQ, will require you to contextualize. So you're looking at the specific topic of the essay and putting it into broader historical events or themes of the time period. And those themes could be regional or national or global. The best places to do context are in the intro and the conclusion. In fact, the very best place to do it is right off the bat in the introduction. If you save it for the conclusion, you can do that, and I'll show you how. The danger is that you run out of time. And so if you do it in the introduction, then you know that you're covered and you get that point. In the introduction, you can do context in one of two ways. So your first option is to write about events that occurred before the time frame of the prompt that helped to set the stage for the topic of the essay. So you should think about this approach to context as like a TV show, where when you turn on the show in the series, at the very beginning they'll say previously on Game of Thrones, and then they'll recap what happened in the last episode. So that's how you should think about this approach to context. You're going to write about events that are within the same bagpipe theme as the topic of the question, but they happened before the time period you're being asked about. So, for example, let's say you have a question that's related to the development of technology from 1950 to the year 2000. That's in the economics theme of the bagpipe. So you might set the stage in your introduction right at the very beginning before your thesis statement. You might set the stage for this topic by describing some technological changes that happened in the years leading up to 1950. Then you'll do your thesis statement, and then you'll jump into your evidence. But this is why it's so important to break down the prompt so that you can think about what exactly am I being asked and attack context in a way that will get you the point. So again, this way of attacking it, you're writing within the same bagpipe theme, but in the time period before the actual prompt is asking you to address. The other way of attacking context in the intro is to write about events that occurred during the time frame of the prompt that help to create the bigger picture for the topic. So that's why I chose this elephant picture here. If you're just looking at the little piece of the picture that you're being asked about in the prompt, you're missing stuff that's happening around it at the time. And so you can attack context by painting that bigger picture. So if you go about it in this way, these are events that are not within the same bagpipe theme as the topic of the question. So if we go with the same question that's related to technology between the years of 1950 and 2000, that's in the economics theme, you might create the bigger picture for that topic by describing what was happening with political parties from 1950 to the year 2000. Or you might write about what was happening in terms of social change, like the civil rights movement and movements of other minorities. So you're writing about the years 1950 to 2000, but you're not writing about the topic that they're asking you to write about. A good strategy here, I think, is if the question is about domestic policy, you would attack context by writing about foreign policy, and vice versa. So this economic change question, that the technology question that I've been thinking about for my examples here, if I'm asked about technology from 1950 to 2000, that's a domestic policy issue. It's stuff happening inside of the country. My context could be a foreign policy context, and I might write about the Cold War conflicts with the Soviet Union, and how that's painting the bigger picture for technological change in the second half of the 20th century. In your introduction, a nice way to transition from your context to your thesis might be to try this phrasing, and I'm just suggesting this to you. You'll write your context sentences, setting the stage or painting the bigger picture, and then you can say, amidst these circumstances, and you mention the topic of the prompt, and then go right into your thesis statement. So you can think about, I really like this picture here, you can think about the topic of your prompt being that golden egg there amidst everything else, all of these other eggs around it. And so the bulk of your essay is going to be about that golden egg, but the context comes around it to help make it more understandable. The other way you can get context, if you don't want to do it in your intro, you can't, or if you forget, or if you're worried that you didn't actually accomplish it in your intro, is you could do it in your conclusion. And so again, this is kind of like a TV show too. It's like the previews at the end of the episode. So if you do context in the conclusion, you will talk about events that occurred after the time frame of the prompt as a result of what you've discussed in your paper. So these are events that would be within the same bagpipe theme as the topic of the question. Again, let's think about my pretend essay prompt about technology from 1950 to 2000 in that economics theme. So if I do context in the conclusion, I might write about technological changes that have happened since the year 2000 that grew out of what was created in the last half of the 20th century. And so this is sort of like a next time on Game of Thrones, like here's what's coming next. If you read the next paper in the series about technology in American history, here's what comes next. But again, the danger of waiting till the conclusion, if you do that on purpose, is that you might run out of time. The big thing to think about for context, and this is kind of counterintuitive, is that context does not answer the prompt. It's not the evidence that you're using to prove your thesis. You're going to save the specific evidence that can be used to answer the prompt for your body paragraphs. So if you've listened to my examples about that pretend prompt about technology from 1950 to 2000, my context has not been anything about what technologies were created between 1950 to 2000. I haven't mentioned anything about televisions or computers or the internet or nuclear weapons. I haven't mentioned any of those things because all of those are things that I'm going to use to answer my question. So that's not context. When you set the context, you're not really answering the question being asked, and that seems kind of odd, but they want you to use context to show that you know why the topic of the essay matters. So you'll save all of your evidence that will answer the prompt, that will prove your answer to the prompt for your body paragraphs, which is the next part of this video, writing the essay evidence, and this is the body paragraphs. So the body of the essay should contain evidence that is accurate, specific, you can see I put that there in bold and caps, it's got to be specific, relevant to the prompt, and chronologically correct. So accurate, obviously they're looking for you to not mess up on factual information. Specific, that means you're shooting for really using your words of the week, if possible. You want proper nouns in there. So there's all kinds of things that you could use as specific evidence. It could be people, it could be laws, court cases, treaties, specific events, philosophical schools of thought, titles of books. So you're shooting to be as specific as possible and give details that will help prove your thesis statement. Chronologically correct. They like to see years in your essay, but not if they're wrong. So if you aren't sure about a year, it's just best to leave it out. Just don't say it. If you know the decade, you could say that if you know it. Otherwise, just don't mention the year. It's better to not have a year in there than to be incorrect in terms of chronology. Your goal is to use the evidence to support your thesis or your argument, and so you need to establish a clear link between the evidence and the thesis. You have to tell your reader why you're incorporating that evidence. So make sure that you are doing that, because that's how you get big points in the evidence and reasoning sections of the rubric, that link that you spell out for the reader. You build an argument by linking your evidence to your claim. If you don't make the link and leave it to the reader to figure it out, they're not going to give you big points. So the way to do that, I think, is to follow this sort of body paragraph structure. You've got your topic sentence. So you'll identify the topic from your roadmap that you'll be addressing. So that's the X, the A, or the B. You'll have a simple topic sentence that links back to the X, the A, or the B from your thesis statement, so your reader knows where they're at in your essay. Once you have that, you're going to give your first thing to prove your thesis statement. And so you should have 2 sentences there at least. You should state your evidence, and that means you're identifying and defining or describing a relevant event, person, law, or term. So you're stating your wow word or your proper noun, and then showing you know what it is by defining or describing it briefly. Then you need a sentence to interpret. And this is where you explain how the event or the person or the law or the term proves your thesis. That's where you're making the link between your evidence and your claim. Don't create a laundry list of pure facts. You're not going from one piece of evidence to the next piece of evidence to the next piece of evidence. You need to show you know something about the evidence that you're using. You have to describe it. And more importantly, you need to explain why the evidence proves your claim. You have to interpret. You're shooting for 3 pieces of evidence per body paragraph. So you'll have a topic sentence, 1 piece of evidence, and then interpret it, a second piece of evidence, and then interpret it, a third piece of evidence, and then interpret it, and if you have time, a transition sentence. But that is not essential. This is not going to be your perfect English essay. You're in a timed, pressured environment. They're not looking for a polished essay. They know it's a rough draft. When you interpret your evidence, keep it simple. Like really, you don't have to make this fancy or complicated. It's okay in those interpretation portions of your body paragraphs to begin with phrases like this. And I'm not sure why there's an extra space after the first bullet point there. But you could, in the interpretation portion, so you've stated your evidence, then you can say this proves, and then you'll mention the phrasing of the X, the A, or the B that you're trying to prove because, and then elaborate on that. You could say this shows, and then mention what's in the topic sentence of your paragraph. Because, this illustrates, because, this demonstrates, because. And so I know that sounds repetitive, but in this timed setting, repetition is okay. You need to just get the job done and get the job done clearly. It's what comes after those introductory phases, after the because, that matters. That's where you're showing your reasoning. They are not grading you on writing style or tone. I mean, obviously you want to have a formal academic paper. You don't want to have a lot of slang, but what's more important is that you're getting your ideas across in a clear way. That's more important than formality or sounding fancy. You don't need to try to sound smart. Getting things across clearly makes it clear you're smart. Finally, step 5 of writing the long essay is to proofread if you have time. So if you have time left, you need to use it. Don't put your pencil down and just take a little nap. You need to use the time that's provided. So if you have time, proofread your essay, and I recommend beginning with the conclusion and working backwards paragraph by paragraph. And check for spelling or grammar as much as you can. If you see a glaring spelling error or something that is really wrong grammar-wise, fix it. What you want to do is make sure your thesis statement matches what you wrote. If you don't, then adjust that thesis statement. You don't need to adjust everything else. Make the most simple change that you can. And if you decide that you need to add things when you're proofreading, avoid making too many insertions in the margins because you want to make reading your essay, you want to be friendly to the reader. You want to make reading the essay easy. And if there's too many things that you're adding in the margins and shoving in with an arrow, sometimes that can make it difficult for your reader to follow along. So we will discuss your questions about context and evidence in class and look at some examples. So hopefully this has been helpful. Come into class ready with questions, and I'll see you later. Have a good night.